Hello, Chameleon Wranglers. My name is Bill Strand, and today we're going to be exploring the different husbandry between the Yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon and the Machakos Hills Jackson's chameleon. Now, if you look at the Jackson's Chameleon profile on the ChameleonAcademy.com website, you'll see that I suggest to keep them identically. In fact, I've been keeping both subspecies the same for many, many years over multiple generations. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that you can treat them the same. But if you have any familiarity with the Chameleon Academy, you know I say always challenge what you think you know. And this is no different. So you may ask, why would I choose this particular thing to challenge? And the reason is because I look at this book right here, Mountain Dragons by Jan Stapala, because it has pictures of both the Machakos Hills as well as the area that Xantholophus, the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, comes from. And in this book, the pictures of those areas are very different. The Machakos Hills area looks dry and dusty, while the Xantholophus areas seem very lush. And so the question is, in my mind, what is the difference here? Even though I've been successful with Machakos Hills Jackson's chameleon being kept just like the Xantholophus, would the Machakos Hills Jackson's chameleon do better in a drier environment? And you see, these are very important questions for us to ask. It's not enough just for the chameleons to survive. Even survive, grow, and breed. Most living organisms will do that even if the husbandry isn't totally correct. But here, when we're studying the art of chameleon herpetoculture, we need to know. And so in a situation like this, where would I go for specific information about the areas where chameleons are found? Well, I am lucky to know the author of this book that has all those pictures. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Jan Stapala to the Chameleon Academy podcast. Hello, Chameleon Wranglers. I am here with Jan Stapala, the author of Mountain Dragons, who has traipsed across the highlands of Kenya studying chameleons. Jan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bill. Thanks very much for inviting me on your show.
All right. So we have in the hobbyist community, we have two main subspecies of Jackson's chameleons, the Xantholophus, the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, and the Machakos Hills Jackson's chameleon, jacksonii. And we've been keeping them the same, in the same conditions, and we've been doing it successfully. But the question is, are they really that similar in the wild? And should we be looking into nuances in our care to better take care of these different variations in Jackson's chameleon? And the reason why I have Jan on is because he's personally been to each one of these locations. And it's you need that personal person there to experience it, because when we get weather data from these weather stations, we'll get a data from Chogoria, which is a city, and Machakos, which is a city, and we don't know if that data actually applies to the areas that the Jackson's chameleons are actually in, and we don't know what the Jackson's chameleons are doing in their microclimates within those areas, and so that's why we need someone like Jan, who's been there and who can share with us what it's like. And so, Jan, can you give us a basic overview of your experiences with Xantholophus and the Machakos Hills?
Sure. Well, I've travelled extensively around Mount Kenya, and also travelled from sort of low elevations up to higher elevations. So I have a quite familiarity with the sort of Mount Kenya environment. It has very extensive forests, and most of my work was in the forests. And it's at lower elevations. It can get pretty warm, but it's obviously a lot cooler in the forest than outside of them. When I travelled to Machakos, I arrived in Machakos town, which is not particularly close to there are patches of forest on the higher hills in Machakos, but it was about 1,600 meters. It was hot, dry, and dusty. We didn't even think we had much chance of finding jacksonii, but within half a kilometre of the town centre, we went on to some hills where there's coffee plantations, and we did find them. So we were very surprised to find Machakos, these jacksonii in the Machakos hills. And what seemed like quite a hostile environment. But that was the only visit there, and you do get a biased picture if you're only somewhere for a short period of time. The coffee crops are a good indication that the climate's actually quite wet at times, and the temperature's quite moderate. And I knew a guy who used to say, if you find coffee, you'll find jacksonii, and it was a kind of fair assessment. And if you look at sort of bioclimatic maps for Kenya, like rainfall maps, you'll see that the Machakos Hills are in a very relatively dry region, but those hills themselves do attract relatively high rainfall and do have a similar climate to the climate around Nairobi and then those sort of lower elevations going towards Mount Kenya. So the Machakos Hills are actually climatically fairly similar in terms of rainfall to other areas where you find jacksonii. With xantholophus, their elevational range is can be as low as 1,600 meters or even slightly lower, up to about 2,000, possibly higher. So there's a bit of a range there in their elevation. So at 1,600 meters, they're probably experiencing conditions similar to the Machakos jacksonii in terms of temperatures. But obviously, once you get to 2,000 meters, you get a drop in temperature with elevation, and obviously inside the forest it would be cooler as well. So animals at those higher elevations will be experiencing lower temperatures. I did look into sort of climatic charts on temperature variations. Say Meru town is an example of an area where you get xantholophus. And the lows there are down to like between 3 to 5 degrees, the extreme lows at any month in the year. And that's pretty chilly. Yeah. And I was surprised at that, actually. I thought they might be more moderated by proximity to the forest. But so those are quite low lows. And then if you look at Machakos, that's only at 1,600 meters, a bit lower elevation, the lows there are only around 10 to 12 degrees, 13 degrees. So it seems like the Machakos jacksonii don't experience quite as low lows. But then having said that, the hills there do get to about 2,200 meters. So if animals were collected from higher up, they may be experiencing lower lows. So, overall, you might conclude they're experiencing roughly similar temperatures. In terms of rainfall, xantholophus' distribution extends up into where there is very high rainfall areas on Mount Kenya, really quite wet. With higher rainfall even during the drier months, but in the lower elevation areas of Mount Kenya, it's experiencing fairly similar rainfall. So two peaks in rainfall for the wet seasons, and then you have a cool dry season from about June to September, where it's noticeably colder part of the year, quite cloudy but relatively dry, with rainfall as low as I think less than an inch in a month. And then a hot, dry season where it was sort of, obviously from the name, warmer temperatures, but again with relatively low rainfall. So both subspecies are experiencing these fluctuations in rainfall as well. So, I think you could argue that they're experiencing roughly similar climatic fluctuations in terms of rainfall patterns and temperature fluctuations. But within each of their distributions, if animals were collected at a higher elevation, I don't know whether there would be within the subspecies range different adaptations to animals from high or low elevations.
Okay. Well, when we have precious few resources for those of us who aren't there, and your book Mountain Dragons is one of those resources. Now, when we see in your book the pictures of the Machakos area, they do seem dry, dusty. And then we look at the xantholophus pictures in your book, and they're a lush rainforest. Now, is this really a difference, or was the area outside of Machakos a lush rainforest until it was cleared?
Yeah, so it would be moist montane forest, similar to sort of Nairobi, the sort of uphill side of Nairobi. So it would be kind of moist montane forest or submontane. So those hills do attract what they call orographic precipitation. They do intercept kind of trade winds and have higher rainfall on the sort of upper slopes, and the coffee is a kind of indication of that. The coffee is only grown in Kenya at higher elevations where the rainfall is high enough for it to grow. So it does show that there are wetter months of the year that aren't necessarily as wet on the lower plains. So those hills are intercepting higher rainfall, but they are still, from my experience of being there, they are still getting very dry during those dry season periods. And when I visited those hills, I really thought I was kind of unlikely to find jacksonii. And it's only really the presence of coffee that we basically went towards the coffee plantations out of town. I thought, well, if we're going to find them, the hills are covered in coffee and also mango trees and other fruit trees. And I guess these crops like that these kind of structurally similar sort of crops that are structurally similar to forest do create the right or more moderate conditions that jacksonii can survive in. So they probably can't survive in maize crops and others that are either temporary or maybe hotter and drier. But I guess where you get these thick bushy environments, they replicate some of the sort of microclimatic conditions of forest, and so that probably helps them to persist.
Do you happen to know if any of the original forest still exists around Machakos?
Yeah, there are forest reserves on the Machakos hills at high elevations. I mean, our project was to really survey as widely as possible, and we really had various setbacks, and we were always under time pressure to kind of get to new sites and new hills that we thought we might find isolated populations, to really try and paint as broad a picture as possible of what populations existed and what genetic variation existed between these populations. So we didn't survey very extensively in the Machakos hills to really build up a more detailed picture and get to visit the forests there. We literally did a kind of flying 2-day visit. We found they were very abundant in the coffee plantations, really quite abundant. But we didn't get a chance to go to the higher hills where there are forest reserves to have a look and maybe get some DNA samples from those, or look at what their morphology as well. So my view of the Machakos Hills jacksonii is a rather limited one. Say compared to Mount Kenya, where we sort of sampled all the way around and at different elevations and built up a more detailed picture.
Now, with the range of the xantholophus around Mount Kenya, how much difference is there from one end of their range to the other end of their range?
Again, you find them outside of natural forest in sort of, again, coffee crops, sort of mango crops. We didn't again try to go to very low elevations to sample for them. Again, we were time constrained, and we were interested in looking at their variation on an elevational gradient. So we sort of started in Chiguria, and there's a route up the mountain called the Chiguria route, and so we started at somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 meters, I think, and really at the edge of the forest. We weren't really able to survey a lot of the plantations at low elevations outside of the forest, and it was a kind of logistical complication of wandering around. With our project, we tended to stay associated with the forest reserves and the national park, and have staff that supported us, and we were restricting ourselves really to surveying within the forest. So we didn't build up a more detailed picture of how widely distributed they were at lower elevations that is mostly croplands. We didn't sort of go downslope, if you like, from the edge of the forests and sort of look at the chameleons as you go towards the lower elevational limit. I guess if we'd had the luxury of more time, we could have chosen to do that, but we were always sort of time constrained and decided that our transect would go uphill, and that was a really interesting picture, because we found jacksonii up to about 2,000 meters, and then as we got to about 2.5, we suddenly found an animal that was completely different, even though this is on the east side of Mount Kenya. And we then found very small chameleons that were like jacksonii, but very small body size compared to xantholophus, and completely different. So we kind of detected this very rapid transition from one type of jacksonii to another on that side of the mountain where you shouldn't have expected to find them. So that kind of picture, we established that picture of variation within jacksonii, but we were less focused on. we just didn't have the luxury of time to sort of, and also the logistical complications of wandering into agricultural areas. We ended up not being.
Private farms, they don't like people walking around.
This is it, and there were security concerns as well that in the end we decided not to do too much of that. So my picture's slightly biased towards these higher elevations and sort of my experiences of these low elevation areas, but they certainly would get, these outside in the kind of outside of the forest, the temperature fluctuations can be more extreme. The temperatures can get to 28 degrees quite regularly, which really feels quite hot. And during the dry season, everything's very dusty. I mean, you do sometimes see photos of jacksonii that have this kind of reddish tint to them, and if they've shed their skin, you have this bright yellowy green patch, and then a bright red patch, darkish brick red patch, and that's the dust off the roads there that kind of is this color of the soil there, a rich sort of orangey red ochre kind of color, and it does settle on the chameleons and give them that kind of color. So they're in a kind of quite a dusty situation, but they're nearly always restricting themselves to trees and sort of areas where they can find shade. And I guess within mature coffee crops, they can escape that kind of heat to some degree.
Okay, so from this discussion, it would appear that giving them similar conditions would replicate what they're experiencing in the wild. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's the case. I mean, it might be that xantholophus can tolerate greater lows if you were to base it on some of that data that sort of climatic data that's been recorded, but whether it's necessary to subject them to the extremes, whether there's an advantage to it. I mean, it depends where your animals are sampled, but I think if people are sampling collected animals for the pet trade originally, which I think are now captive bred on farms, they wouldn't have. I think those animals were sampled from the sort of farm bush kind of agricultural areas, not from within the forest. So they wouldn't have been collected from higher elevations. I mean, I've heard someone comment about Hanelli, which is found in that area, that they were a German breeder who said if you get animals from high elevation areas, that you then need to give them those real lows for them to do well in captivity, as though they were adapted and needed the more extreme lows because that's where they'd been collected from. But I don't think with jacksonii, I think most of the collecting is done in the most easily accessible areas, which should have been at the more lower elevations. So they probably are from more similar climatic areas, the animals that are in captivity, the two different subspecies.
Okay. And a slightly unrelated but interesting question. Did you ever experience any location where there was an overlap of subspecies of jacksonii or overlap of locales?
Not an overlap. There were, as I said, on the Chagoury route, it's probably the most extreme case of we found something very peculiar at park headquarters for the Aberdare National Park, and it's kind of on the edge of the Aberdare National Park, just where the forest transitions into savanna, and we surveyed the park headquarters there, and we found animals that looked a bit like xantholophus, and we also found some very tiny animals there, and it looked like we were looking at two different morphologically distinct kind of types of jacksonii in this one location. Okay. But I don't think the genetics showed up any differences, and it was, but that was a sort of rather surprising situation, and whether if we'd sampled more widely, whether we might have detected something outside of in a more natural setting, because that was in this one compound in a kind of almost like savanna area. On Mount Kenya, we never, within like say 5 or 10 miles, we might see a jump from one morphological type to another, or like on the Chagoury route, probably within about 5 kilometers, there was a distinct jump, but never within the sort of same, patch of forest within like a sort of short walking distance, or literally within a few meters of each other. We never found, but that may exist. I mean, we really struggled to find chameleons. Like when we did the transect on the Chagoury route, we took 3 or 4 hours to drive from 3,000 meters down to the park gate, That's about 13 kilometers, or maybe even 20 kilometers. We did 13 kilometers a night. We only found 3 or 4 animals in 13 kilometers.
Oh,
So
wow.
within the forest at low elevations, we didn't find xantholophus. We actually found some outside of the forest, but we didn't find xantholophus in the forest. And it may have been the season, and we heard that in the cool, dry season they tend to go higher up in the trees, and we did notice a difference in the ability to find animals when that season sort of kicked in. So we were finding so few animals over such a sort of widely spaced distance that it's not like we could find a dozen animals within 100 yards and detect that, what you're describing, that phenomenon. Okay. So it may exist, but the frequency that we're finding animals was so sparse that we couldn't have, at least within the time we had, we were unable to detect enough animals to see whether there was I suppose what you're describing is, or trying to ask is there like a contact zone where one subspecies meets the other and there isn't a sort of evidence of hybrids. So I think that would be an interesting follow-up project, would be to sample along that eastern sort of transect going up the mountain and try to detect whether there is a rather distinct break in morphology from very large xantholophus type animals to suddenly getting the jacksonii type animals.
Okay.
But that's work to do.
All right, Jan, I want to thank you very much for coming on. This has been some great information that we're not able to get from books and in the internet.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's always nice to chat to you, Bill.
And so after all this exploration, we find that we're back where we started from. We can keep the xantholophus and the Machakos Hills Jackson's chameleon in identical conditions. But it is a little bit different because we have taken something that we thought we knew and we explored it. We picked it apart. We tried to find the weakness in it. And what we did in that process is we found out why there's an apparent contradiction between what we're seeing in our husbandry and in the pictures of the area where they were found. And I'd like to encourage all of you, do not be afraid of challenging what you think you know and really try to disprove it. Don't just go through the motion and the steps of, oh, okay, I checked it out, so yeah, I was right to begin with. No. What we're doing is we're trying to disprove what we thought was right. And if we are trying our best to disprove it and we can't disprove it, that is strong evidence that what we believed was right. And so this is what I and all of you have gained through this process. Now, when we say that you can keep Machakos Hills Jackson's chameleon the same as you keep the xantholophus or yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, it's more than just, well, we've always done it that way. It is, we've checked into it and we have verified that the areas in Kenya where they are from are pretty much identical. And if somebody brings out any of these pictures of the dry areas of Machakos, then we can explain the apparent contradiction. Coming to the same conclusion as to where we started is not going back to where we started. We have grown in our art because we challenged it and we put it through its paces. And that is what we do on the Chameleon Academy. Now, this book that we've been talking about, Mountain Dragons by Jan Stapala, this is a pictorial journal of his journeys through the highlands in Kenya looking for chameleons, and you're going to be seeing chameleons in there you've never seen before. This book was self-published by Jan, and he only did one printing. If you're in the US, you can get a copy of this through dragonstrand.com, and I'll go ahead link to that in the description or show notes. But Jan doesn't have that many boxes left, and so I encourage everyone to get one of these. These are very rarely found at used bookstores because it is so awesome. The photography is amazing. And you can find the link to this in the show notes or just go to dragonstrand.com. And if you've not heard about it yet, I'd like to introduce you to the Chameleon Academy Journal, which is a digital magazine that talks about everything going on in the Chameleon Academy. In fact, the last issue had an article about this exact topic. And so if you flipped through that magazine, then you knew what we were going over, and this was just the details. The Chameleon Academy Journal is a wonderful experience for those of us who love chameleons and would just love to get a cup of coffee, sit down on a Saturday morning, and flip through a magazine dedicated to chameleons. The Chameleon Academy Journal is free on the ChameleonAcademy.com website. And if you'd like notifications of when the next issue comes out, it'll come out every other month, then just sign up for the Chameleon Academy newsletter and you'll get that information in your inbox. Thank you very much for joining me here. It is wonderful going through this exploration in this chameleon world that we all love, and having you come along with me while I do this makes it all the more worth it. So go enjoy that we can spend time with these mini tree dragons, and I'll see you next time.